Government established Operation Vulindlela as a means to implement reforms that would fast-track the growth of South Africa's economy. And they have mostly targeted key industries like electricity, the upgrading of telecoms and so on by fast-tracking the expansion of the spectrum and logistics. Let's talk about it more broadly now and its success over the last 3 years. I'm joined by Economist Phelisa Nkomo. Phelisa, good morning to you and welcome to the program. It's 4 years old, and as I mentioned in the introduction, they're really aimed at creating targeted structural economic reforms. And if you ask Operation Vulindlela's custodians what their progress has been, they'll say, well, we've made progress in energy, we've made progress in electricity. Look at the number of private investments that are taking place there. If you look at logistics, same story, private investments in the ports as well. So the picture is growing and it is stabilizing. What's your view?
Well, I mean, firstly, when you evaluate some of these interventions, man, you shouldn't apply one size fits all. I think that's the first principle that we must establish. And then the second issue is that you must then look at them and say, what objective that we seek to achieve? I think from an energy perspective, for instance, I think we've seen a lot of improvement, particularly 90 days leading to the elections, by the way. I mean, we've really not experienced any of the load sheddings we've had in the previous month, February backwards. That's one thing. I think the second issue for me is that Operation Vulindlela, amongst just broadly that it seeks to achieve, is private participation in sectors which traditionally were actually being driven by government. Now, one of the key issues here we must address is that you can't all the time actually when there are inefficiencies in public sector and then immediately look at what is the private sector actually can do. Because private sector has its own inefficiencies, one, but also two, there are risk embedded into it, which is amongst the key things, is that private sector is interested in profit maximization. And so the key issue is that you must always make the balance and then say, even South Africa, you're sitting with 32.9% unemployment, and you're looking for private sector participation in water, in electricity. What are the implications around equity issues? How do we make it sure? How are we going to make it sure that, in fact, private sector is not milking or is not choking citizens by overcharging them because they have interest in actual profit maximization? And then the fourth issue I want to raise is the fact that I think one of the key issues, even with the logistics sector participation around your private sector participation in the logistics sector. I mean, one of the key things we must really think about and say, if Transnet, we're looking for private sector investment within Transnet, what is it that we want to achieve? Over the years, by the way, overall, the National Treasury has actually invested about 500 billion in state-owned enterprises. But the key issue we're not addressing is what are the structural issues within those institutions? Let me make an example. In early 90s, when we got into a democratic dispensation, we introduced in state-owned enterprises what we call corporatization. Now, one of the biggest mistakes we made there, corporatization amongst the key things, it means that businesses that were owned by the states need to be able to raise capital in the financial market. They must be able to report on their balance sheets. They are going to be independent. They're not going to be really be getting, annual injection from the state. And then, in addition to that, it means that we remove them as part of fiscal liabilities, meaning that they can't be counted as a government debt. But in our case, we kept them. We paid them massive wage bill. If you go and read the type of salaries that are being earned by women and men who work in the state-owned enterprises are massive. And the key issue, and then in return, what we then thought we were going to do is that they need to then come back and invest in what we call developmental objectives.
Yeah.
Part of those development objectives is to stimulate the economy, create jobs, etc. Now, you must know that once you start actually facilitate a private sector participation, some of those development objectives, by the way, may not be met or may not be a priority anymore because the private sector partner who's investing and increasing the balance sheet of the state-owned enterprises might have completely a different interest going forward.
So
in essence,
I want to stop you there, Phelisa, because there's some things I want to just kind of circle back to in what you've shared with us, which I think was quite a great inventory when you look at some of the areas Vulindlela is operating in and who the benefit has been for. It echoes an earlier conversation we had on the program a short time ago about, who is the growth for? Who is it benefiting? And I think it's a similar question in a different context that you're asking here. Now, government will say part of these structural reforms is about creating stability, because you need, in order to attract investment, you need to create stability in all of these sort of key sectors where we see the biggest economic boon and benefit coming from. How then should they be taking the task going forward if, as you say, according to your argument, that even for private sector investments, the benefits almost seem to benefit them exclusively, and it's not an inclusive benefit to everyone else in the economy?
The first issue, Imani, we are going to rely on you as media houses, but I suppose as well as Parliament. We must then be able to scrutinize what is the methodology that is used on the private sector participation per sector. So remember, it's electricity. We know that Eskom was spending billions on IPPs, right? Even though we still went on load shedding. The second one now is going to be logistics. What's the agreement? Let's scrutinize the agreements that the private participation actually has been entered into. And then the third one is going to be water. Now, you know that water is the primary right in terms of human development index. And therefore, if you are actually establishing an entity that's going to be driving water on the back of increased service delivery, but also at the same time thinking that you have inefficiencies. But there's a biggest issue for me that we really need to deal with. One of those is that in our public governance system, every time public governance fails, we create a new institution, and then we do this because we have not been able to embed what we call meritocracy in people that we get to a point in position of power who, and I mean, this one is not even politician in this context. It's even people that are meant to drive that, right? Now, obviously, whenever you undertake some of the structural changes or transformation within any economy, you then need to look at it and say, where is your development paradigm? And what is it that you actually need to do? So obviously, the fourth issue that we need to really look at and say, because in some of these micro structural reforms they're introducing, has to be met by other interventions, which is, what is the Department of Trade and Industry doing to make it sure that it drives industrial development? Because at the port, you need goods, right? You need goods that are manufactured in this country, that leaves the shores of this country to be exported. Currently, our industrial capability has reduced from 49% in 1994. It's actually sitting at 19%. And just to simplify it, right, it means that 81% of the things that we consume in this economy actually imported outside of this country. Now, the economic point, that link that I want to make here is that if, for instance, you are pushing for private sector participation at the port level, what is it that you are doing to stimulate the economy? So that, in fact, we know that the terms unto which we're entering with a private sector participation in the port is not only openly protracted, but in fact, it's reinforced by a robust economic interventions, but also a working economy. So that you know that after 10 to 15 years, you can say to the private sector, thank you very much. We think that we are actually doing well. Because one of the biggest issues about transit, and I know a lot of people say, no, I mean, the backlog, it's about a lot of goods arrive at the port and there's clearance. That's one component that's important. We know they are under declaration a lot of times, which is linked to corruption. There are issues around administrative issues, which is linked with SARS, which SARS has been resolving. But the biggest one is the fact that we actually need to make sure that we have more goods that leave our shores to be exported. And currently, we only have on average 19% that leave this coast. And instead, we are importing a lot more. So it means that the revenue that transit require is actually much more lower than what we actually wish they should be getting. They should be getting from a robust economy, because our economy has shrunk. You might have known that 3 weeks ago, our economy got a GDP statistics from Stats say that we're growing at 0.1%, lower than the projected 0.6%. Now, any economy, for our economy to really be robust, you actually need on average above 2.5% to actually 3% for it to be able to make it sure that we limit private sector participation in sectors that are perceived to be strategic. Transnet remains a strategic resource for South Africa and the citizens of this country. So any private sector participation must be scrutinized, and I want you to send this message very clearly. I'm not averse to private sector participation, but fact, we must always learn what we've done at Eskom and what type of benefits are we reaping for us to pursue other private sector participation in other areas.
I think really important concerns you're raising around scrutinizing the methodology behind those deals. What is the, what are the trade-offs in those private sector participation deals? What's in the agreement? I think is a question certainly we should continue to ask going forward. Very little time left. Perhaps we can just deal with this though, because what Operation Vulindlela will say, and I'm just reading through their own sort of scorecard on the issue of water. They've now been, more efficient, they say, at clearing the water use licenses. It's now processed, the majority of them, 70% of those, processed within 90 days. They've unlocked, billions of rands to our GDP. And not only that, they say that there has been a benefit to the economy of 63,000 jobs. So it's one of those stories they'll say in response to what you've said, who's this for? Who's it really benefiting? And does it have the growth creation traction that it should? They'll say, well, here's an example. Agree or disagree with that? Or are we using, again, the wrong lens to view it?
That's very important. Firstly, let me make this point. Water is a scarce resource for South Africa. Secondly, we've been experiencing climate change crisis in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape, right? And obviously, if you apply only the economic lens when you're addressing access to water, it's actually going to be problematic because you need to apply environmental lenses as well in terms of how to address future scarcity issues. I think obviously the third issue, it's good that the water license backlog is being cleared. However, I know that subsistence farmers, small farmers, and medium would say to the contrary around the application process, the expenses associated with that, but also fundamentally the fact that there is still a regulation, which I saw that they were saying is going to Parliament.
All right, I'm going to leave it there, Phelisa. Sorry, we're just heading to the top of the hour. But again, it's worth, a bigger discussion around these macroeconomic moves. Which sectors are being targeted? Where do we really unlock that real growth to shift the needle on the big unemployment numbers that we have? And most importantly, create the kind of economic growth that we should in a way that does serve and include more South Africans, many more than are currently included right now.